Joel, would you come up here now? This is our speaker tonight. It's Joel Stone, and we're excited to have him here tonight. He's from the Detroit Historic Society, and he'll be speaking on the famous architect Albert Kahn. And Albert Kahn has a big connection here to Willow Run because he was the one who designed the bomber plant and facilitated getting that thing up in about a year. So please welcome Joel as our speaker.
Certainly is nice to be here. This is an incredible facility. Boy, it's fun to have stuff like that. I wish I could get boats into the Dawson Museum. I have to admit, I'm a boat guy. I'm not a plane guy. Although being a sailor, the wings look familiar, and the aerodynamics, we all understand that kind of stuff. I also got to admit right off the bat, I'm not an architect. I'm not an architectural historian. I am a historian for the city of Detroit, and I if you live in Detroit or if you live in the area, you can't miss this guy. Hence the name of the presentation, the ubiquitous Mr. Kahn. Albert Kahn seems to be everywhere, and there's a good reason why he's close to our heart. Before I go on, just a real quick thing. I always forget to bring flyers and that kind of thing. But if you go to DetroitHistorical.org, it's got all the information. We've got about all the programs we do, history tours, church tours, the exhibits we're putting on, the presentations, the lectures, all of that kind of stuff's there. Good. Commercial over. Except some of you may remember the streets of Old Detroit. How many people have been to the Detroit Historical Museum or the Dawson Museum? Oh, God bless you. That's wonderful. And most people who come up to me are all your age, and they come up and say, "Do you still got the streets of Old Detroit?" I haven't been there since I was a Cub Scout. Come on back and see it. We renovated both museums about 3 or 4 years ago. Admission is free. So come on back and see us. We also have the Dawson Museum, of course, also a beautiful facility, and we would like to have you there. So,
I'm an architect, and I worked for 8 years for the Albert Kahn.
Well, sit there and don't say anything, okay? No, actually, I have to say, I gave this presentation recently at Lawrence Technological University. They had a wonderful program about Albert Kahn. They've actually got his office installed there. And it was full of architects, engineers, and the CEO and the managing partner of Albert Kahn. And they actually said I did a good job. So I think I got it. I think I got it right. I throw this slide up just to remind us that Detroit has been blessed with many, many fine architects. Donaldson and Meyer, who did a lot of the things on Belle Isle. Smith, Hinchman, and Grill's been around for a long time. Gino Rossetti, Lewis Camper, who did the book building and the book Cadillac. Charles Agree, who was into some of the mid-century modern stuff. Alpheus Chittenden, the Detroit Boat Club, and so many other things. Of course, Eliel and Ariel Saarinen. There's a great new film out on Arrow. Wonderful stuff. Yamasaki, of course, his things all over the world. Mason and Rice, very important to the Albert Kahn story. Wirt Rowland. How many people know who Wirt Rowland is besides him? Okay. The Guardian building, the Penobscot building. Wirt Rowland was as much an artist as Albert Kahn was. So why does Albert Kahn's name bubble up to the top? Not just locally, not just nationally, but internationally. Okay? He was an artist, but he was so much more, and we're going to go there. Kahn has variously been described as a revolutionary or derivative, as stark or graceful, as innovative or utilitarian, compact, expansive, brusque, pleasant, intense, and shy. So was Albert Kahn an enigma? Some might argue, but Albert Kahn would have hated that. Albert Kahn liked things simple. He liked things straight ahead and honest. That's the kind of guy he was. Most would agree that he was a quiet, driven visionary who contributed to the modernization of industrial architecture, taking it from the first industrial revolution into the second industrial revolution. But he did so much more than that. Before Albert Kahn, I always like starting the presentation with before Albert Kahn. Factories were generally built on what they call the New England mill style building. They were essentially brick on the outside. Wow, I can hear me now. And maybe you can hear me too. Brick on the outside, American hung windows. We're familiar with some of these. This is Detroit Stoveworks, was around for a long time. This building down at Detroit Copper and Brass, that building very much like that is still standing down there on Jefferson Avenue at Clark Street. Anybody who's been to the Paquette plant will recognize this. This is a very similar, very typical style for about 100 years in the United States. The biggest problem is we moved into the second industrial revolution. They were mostly built of wood framing, wood floors, the posting because of the structural needs very close to each other. It was not a style that was properly or could be properly adapted to the expansiveness that was required by the growing automobile business. They weren't necessarily safe. I mean, there wasn't a lot of light in there. There wasn't a lot of air circulation. Of course, the machine tools, dripping oil on the wood floors all the time, huge fire hazard. This is not the way to make a modern factory, and Albert Kahn knew that. Before Albert Kahn, real architects didn't build factories. They left that to the engineers. Real architects built skyscrapers. Real architects built beautiful homes. Before Albert Kahn, the architect was in a building over here in an office, and the engineers were in a building over here in an office, and the construction folks who were going to build the darn thing were in a whole separate building in an office. Albert Kahn's the guy that brought them all to the same table. He hired everybody that it took to put this whole thing together. Instead of having office boys running back and forth with drawings, Albert Kahn had them all sitting at the same table agreeing on what needed to happen. Because of that, Albert Kahn could build buildings faster than almost anybody. This became very, very important. So before Albert Kahn, that's a great way to start a legacy story, but who is Albert Kahn? Or better yet, who is Albert Kahn today? I mean, today he's certainly a legacy, but a legacy's got to have life. It's got to have some legs. And certainly he's all around us. If I finish this exhibit and you don't drive around Detroit going, Albert Kahn, Albert Kahn, Albert Kahn, then I didn't do my job tonight, okay? You're going to realize how close it is. Albert Kahn is part of hundreds, thousands of buildings, actually, that he left us to admire and to appreciate. Albert Kahn is still a thriving architectural practice, still going strong. And like all of us, Albert Kahn is a unique culmination of everything that came before him, and he's still with us, again, all over the city. So that's who he is. Let's go back to who he was. Albert Kahn was born in Raunen, Germany, in 1869, so just a few years after our Civil War. He was the oldest of 6 children, born into a relatively poor family. His father was a rabbi, his father Joseph, his mother Rosalie. His father made a living doing many things, and as I understand it, not a lot of a living. They moved when he was relatively young right across the Luxembourg border in Enternacht and lived with his aunt. His aunt happened to be the person that taught him how to play the piano. And I don't know that most people know that Albert Kahn was a very fine pianist. He was prodigy as a kid, could have gone on to a wonderful career as a musician. But that's not what he was all about. They came to Detroit in 1880. This picture was taken a few years after that, but this gives you an idea of kind of what Detroit was all about. In 1880, the City Hall was the tallest building in town. Everything else, Civil War era, 3, 4, maybe 5 stories tall was about what he had. There were relatives in town here that made the transition easier. His earliest education is he started with an office boy with John Scott, and this is probably the building we most easily equate with John Scott. As an office boy, he was working part-time. He was doing many other chores. One of the chores was currying horses, and he would usually do that first thing in the morning and then arrive at John Scott's office smelling like horses. That wasn't so popular, and Scott didn't see much in him, but he did understand that the guy had an artistic bent, so he got him a kind of an internship with Julius Melchers. And Julius Melchers was a sculptor and one of Detroit's early resident artists, and Melchers taught him how to draw, which was a really important part of his education. He then hooked up with George Mason in 1885. Not to throw the dates around, but they're kind of important because at this point, George Mason is not this age. George Mason is 26 years old. George Mason has his own architectural firm. Albert Kahn is 16 years old and becomes his assistant. And in fact, one of the very first things Kahn gets to do, Mason gets the contract through the Macmillan family. The D&C line built the Grand Hotel up on Mackinac, and they gave the contract to Mason. And Mason got Kahn to build what part of the Grand Hotel? You bet. Okay? So his very first professional gig is making the largest porch in the country. The one that's still there, the one that people pay to get on today. So not a bad way to start. Clearly had talent. He won a fellowship to go over to Europe and study architecture. And he did. He went over there. He had about $500 in his pocket for about 3 or 4 months, which seemed like a lot of money, but it really wasn't if you're traveling around. But the good part was is he ran into another fellow, a guy named Henry Bacon. Also an architect. We probably best know him through the Lincoln Memorial. And the two of them hooked up, and they were great friends. Bacon had gotten $5,000, so they traveled fairly well. And they got over to Germany, they got to Luxembourg, but they also got to England, and through France, Belgium. And this is Albert Kahn, and from what I've been told, I was down at Kahn Associates doing some research and talking to some people there. Kahn never used a ruler when he was doing this kind of stuff. Most architects will start by drawing some pretty straight lines, and then they'll work off of that. Kahn freehanded all of this stuff, and he also loved detail. He loved getting into the detail of the classicism that existed throughout that. When he returned from Europe, he became the chief designer for Mason. He's now 19 or 20 years old, very, very young, very, we'd call it a startup firm today, but they were doing very well. He designed the William Livingstone House, which was a real nice house. It was on Elliott Street and in the subdivision down there right by the stadiums. And they ended up moving it about 30 years ago, and the move didn't go well. The whole house was kind of collapsing. They called it the Smiling House before it finally got torn down. The important part, though, was that Livingston was the head of the Lake Carriers Association. He owned some vessels. He was in charge of getting a channel built down by Boblo so that the vessels weren't running aground. They call it the Livingston Channel. But he also was the head of the Dime Bank Building. He was head of the Detroit Photographic Company. He had a lot of things going for him. He was a very, very fine patron to have. And that was one of Albert Kahn's really strengths is he must have had a wonderful personality because he made friends very quickly, and the friends he made lasted his lifetime. Fortunately for him, many of them were very wealthy friends. He started with Livingston, but he went on, and we'll talk about some of those as we go. 1896, big year for Kahn. Oh, there's the Livingstone House. I should have thrown that up there. Beautiful, beautiful architecture, but derivative. This is nothing new. He's getting his sea legs. So 1896, he marries Ernestine Krolik. Krolik's father had a dry goods store, much like Hudson's, basically started, and the Kroliks were very well off. So that was a good marriage for him. He then started an independent partnership with a guy named George Nettleton, and Alex Trowbridge. Trowbridge went on pretty soon after they had this project in hand to become the dean at the at Cornell School of Architecture. So he was a good architect too. Kind of left Kahn and Nettleton to finish this project. So they did the first big children's hospital down there. Nettleton soon after died. So Kahn was back on his own, and he kind of turned back to George Mason. They no longer were working in the same office, but Mason kept feeding him business to get the business going, and they again were friends for most of his life. He then got his brother, and again he had several brothers who were involved in the business. His brother Julius, in fact, here's a picture of Julius right here at Willow Run. just before Kahn died. They've just finished the plant. They haven't put a bomber out. Kahn died in 42. But his brother Julius was rather an engineering genius. Albert had put him through U of M's engineering school, and Julius came up with this idea for trussing concrete with steel bars. And this is the first building, the Palms apartment building. It's still there on Jefferson, just east of where 375 comes out onto Jefferson Avenue. You can still see it. I think they need to raise the rents. The shades on the windows look a little tired. But the building is still there. This is some of the patents that Julius had for putting trusses in the concrete and for getting this company off the ground. This was a wonderful starting point because it gave Kahn a tool where he could open up those small factory floors with those posts that are way too close together. Kahn was able to use this truss concrete to widen things up and get them going. He had a couple of wonderful things. Another one of his patrons was Jamesscrips of the Detroit News family. He did things for the Scripps, for the Booths. Got out on his own. Again, he's away from Mason, but Mason's steering things his way. Temple Belle Isle, Albert Kahn was a very devout Jew. I'm not sure how often he went to synagogue because he was very often working, but he was very, very devoted to his church and, in fact, built 2 Temple Belle Isles through his life. He also got involved. We can see on the inside how big he's been able to, the expansive spaces that he's now working in. He did some work on Belle Isle. He did the Jamesscrips Whitcomb Conservatory, which is still there. He worked on the aquarium. He did not do the Belle Isle Conservatory or the casino, often credited, but this is a Van Leyen and Schilling project that Kahn consulted on. So he did the memorial flagpole. Smith was the guy that wrote America the Beautiful, and kids put pennies in to build him a flagpole, and Kahn designed it. Very nice Art Deco. When William Livingstone died, the Lake Carriers Association put money together to build a lighthouse, and it's the only marble lighthouse in North America. Albert Kahn designed it. Beautiful, beautiful Art Deco. If you want to see kind of the very beginnings of Kahn's Art Deco feel, this is a wonderful thing to see. He did several buildings up at the University of Michigan, starting with the engineering building, still there, still very active building. And then he started to get into the automotive business. He didn't do it here in Detroit. He did it in Buffalo. The Pierce Bicycle Company decided they wanted to build cars. We know the Pierce Arrow, of course, is probably the most popular one. But this is what he started with, old New England mill-style building. Okay, Kahn knew that wasn't going to work if we were getting into the automotive business, so this is what he built them. And they were bigger. They had larger windows. You can see that there's the louvering in the roofs in order to try to get ventilation through the buildings. This was kind of the template for what was going to come later. Anybody who's driven up Woodward Avenue past the Ford Highland Park plant, if you've driven by that building, it looks a whole lot like the Pierce headquarters. The Ford headquarters, the Pierce headquarters, almost identical. And if you look at the building behind that, well, there you'll start to see what I call the Kahn Square. And if I can walk away just a minute, I'm going to drive my cameraman crazy. But you're going to see that right here is something that Albert Kahn figures out and starts repeating ever after. That Kahn Square, that repetition, he brings back to Detroit and he puts to work for Henry Joy, another one of his very fine patrons. Henry Joy had the Packard Company, and Kahn built all of the buildings there. He started the first 9, not so important. They were pretty derivative. They weren't much different than the Piquette plant, but then he figured out that this truss concrete could serve him very well. And so he built this building 10, and it really kind of set the standard for what was going to happen later on in many, many of his buildings. So you'll start to see that Kahn Square. I'm not going to walk away from the camera again, I promise. But you're going to start to see that Kahn Square as we go through this presentation. You can see it right there. It stands right out, reinforced concrete with whatever else you want to put in there. You can put brick up for 3 feet and the rest is windows. You can put brick up for 8 feet and 3 feet of windows. You can have it all windows. Whatever you want to do within that Kahn Square was possible. And then he started using the truss steel without the concrete, a more modern adaptation. He did this for a couple of people. This is the Mergenthaler linotype. You can kind of see the old mill architecture to the right, the new Kahn architecture in the Kahn Square to the left. And he got into this business at a wonderful time. Okay, 1904, nationwide we made 22,000 cars. 1914, we made 250,000 cars. 1917, we made almost 750,000 cars. So he's getting into this business, and remember, Detroit is taking off at this point. If you go to the pardon me, if you go to the city directories and you look up the number of car companies in Detroit and compare it with other cities, you know, Jackson had a couple of car companies. Chicago had several car companies. 1915, Detroit had 40 companies making cars and another 70 companies supplying those manufacturers. Detroit was the motor capital of the world by 1915, and Albert Kahn is on at the ground floor building for all of these people. He's making all of these things. Kahn's quote, "Where the problem is new, a new solution must be found to fit it." And indeed, that's what he did. He gets his own firm going. He decides that you don't need to make a plant for automobiles that's ugly, that's hard to work in. You can make it a pleasant place to work and still efficient. And he was very, very good at that. This is fun. There's 3 in a row here. So this is 1916. Ford's got 1,200 employees at the Highland Park plant, or 12,000 rather. A couple of years later, he's got 36,000 employees. And 2 more years later, he's got 50,000 employees. So this is Highland Park. Ford called Kahn in and said, can you build factories? And Albert Kahn says, I can build anything. But then he had an addendum that he put in his autobiography. He said, I thought Ford was crazy. I didn't think it was possible, but I didn't tell him that. I wanted to see what could be done. And he certainly did. And you can see that the Kahn Square is standing out here without a question. And that was a relationship that went on for a long time. I'm not going to debate Henry Ford's anti-Semitism or non-Semitism or Albert Kahn's religiosity, but the two of them got along well for their entire career. He built hundreds of buildings for Ford. This is at the Highland Park plant. You can see how much light's coming in those windows. Those windows can be opened so that there's fresh air. That's the concrete part. You can see across the top that he's now using the structural steel. You can also see how big and open this plant is, and it's adapted. They can put pressing machines in there, and it's not going to damage the foundation of the building. It works this way. And because of that, he helped Henry Ford build the Roush Plant, build all of it. And they didn't start with cars. I don't think most people know that the Roush Plant, the first thing they built was boats, except a boat guy. Okay, I'm going to know this. This is World War I. Toward the end of World War I, Ford convinced the Navy that he could build submarine chasers, basically, on an assembly line, an assembly line process. They started at one end with laying the keel. It was on trucks. They pushed it down a railroad thing, and when it came out the other end of this building, there was a finished boat. They'd bring it over and put it in a canal that the Navy built for Ford. Ford got him to pay for that and straightening out the Rouge River. It worked very well in his favor. As it turns out, the war ended before half the contract was filled. As it turned out, these were terrible boats. Any boaters here? Okay. If you've dealt with a hardship, they were like a box. And the part where the turn is made is called a chine. And many boats are really soft chined, and these were hard chined. They came down and they turned really fast because that's the way you could make the plates. Very uncomfortable. They sold most of them to the Chilean Navy, and they scrapped the rest of them. But he started building boats, and then he helped Henry Ford build stuff. And now you can see that he's getting into some more traditional factory construction, the kind of construction that really opened the buildings up. And he ended up building most of the buildings, if not, I'm sure there are some small buildings in there that he wasn't responsible for, but Albert Kahn did most of that. Largest manufacturing facility in the world at the time. He liked glass. He really liked getting light inside of a building, and he did things like this. This is over in Chicago, the Chrysler DeSoto press plant, the Chrysler half-ton plant. I mean, not only is he working for Ford and building the whole Roush Plant, he's working for Chrysler, he's working for GM, he's working for Chalmers, he's working for all of the other car manufacturers. Some very fancy cantilever stuff that he does. I mean, we're now getting into the artistic part of what he was capable of doing. Of course, the Chrysler tank arsenal, 7 months from groundbreaking to turning out the first tank. Kahn was known for making buildings fast. And when we were at war, that's exactly what the government wanted to hear. You know, Willow Run, I'm sure that you guys know this story better than I. The building was built fast. It took Ford a while to figure out how to make the bombers, okay? But Kahn was able to get the building done. Curiously, this was the last project that he worked on. And while he spent most of his life creating air and light in factories, this building was mostly closed up for the darkening, you know, the blackout measures. It didn't have the windows that Kahn was usually known for. So he wasn't opposed to turning away from an idea he had built his whole career on and done something else. And at the time it was built, I believe the largest aircraft manufacturing facility in the world. In the world. Factory, period.
But didn't Kahn's company build a bigger one in Chicago for the B-29 engine?
I don't know. After this one was built, I'll have to look. So, and also notable, and you guys probably know this as well as anybody, Kahn took this around the world. There are Albert Kahn buildings on every continent except Antarctica, and lots of buildings for the Russians. The tank plants, or the tractor plants that Stalin was building and eventually repurposed to make tanks. You know, we did save the world when it came to World War II. I mean, we made 20% of everything that the Allied forces used. We made 30% of everything that all the other armies on the Allied side used, based out of Detroit here. But the Soviets made more tanks by double than what we made. So that's what Albert Kahn helped them do over there. So Kahn, this is, 90% work and 10% fun. This is basically what Kahn said about it. Industrial architecture is business. It's all about the business. But Kahn had a flavor for doing other things than that. I started my business career working in the basement at Grinnell's. I don't know, some people might remember Grinnell's around here back in the sheet music days, back when they used to sell sheet music. What those days were, huh? Anyways. Beautiful building. This was right across from the building he built for Krolik. It's his father-in-law on Woodward Avenue. Of course, the National Theater, to me, is one of the most spectacular buildings in Detroit. I believe Gilbert owns it. They haven't started restoring it, to my knowledge, but I'm really hoping they do. Kahn didn't do a lot of theaters. There were other people, C. Howard Crane and other people in Detroit who were really very good at theaters. So Kahn stayed out of that business. He did just the one up in Ann Arbor, Hill Auditorium, and then the two Temple Bethels were really kind of his theater work. But he did some beautiful buildings. They call it American Vertical if you're in an architectural world, and many of his buildings, like the Free Press building, did that. He also built not only the Detroit Golf Club, but the Country Club of Detroit clubhouse, the Detroit News building, again, more buildings in Ann Arbor, Angel Hall, the beautiful little Clements Library, which to him was always kind of his finest little masterpiece. He had some big masterpieces, but to him that was one of his special little pieces, because Clement gave him carte blanche. Do whatever you want and just build it. The Detroit Athletic Club, of course, just celebrated their 100th anniversary of this building by putting another story on top of it. Architectural purists may hold it against them, but it actually is a nice addition, and I think Albert Kahn probably would have appreciated. Detroit Bank and Trust Company, the National Bank of Detroit building, this was going up just at that time. The Truss Concrete building off to the left there, again, Kahn Squares, Detroit Police Headquarters at 1300 Beaubien, and then, of course, the General Motors. He got into the new center area, which the General Motors and the Fisher brothers kind of got together to develop that as all of the space downtown had been used, so they needed some new space. You can still see the old tenements right there, the wrong side of the tracks in the foreground, and he's building this massive, beautiful building in the background there. Again, lots of light, lots of air, and very, very classical styling. Spectacular building. This building here was for Ford. It was their Ford service and marketing, sales and marketing was there. You'll see that kind of as Kahn Squares. You're also going to see Kahn Squares kind of popping up down in the lower side here. We've got another one there. They're just, as you drive around Detroit, you're going to start to see the Kahn Square in all of the buildings, all of the old factories that are still left. The Fisher building, of course, this was, if the Clements Library was his small piece de resistance, the Fisher building was his grand piece de resistance. And I threw the picture of Joseph French in there just because I like to remind people that Albert Kahn didn't build all these buildings. He had a wonderful team put together, a great group of folks who could do this kind of thing. French was actually the project manager on this, but Kahn had his hand in selecting the various marbles and selecting the various facades and what the inside was going to look like. And truly, if everybody's, I believe, been in the Fisher building, it is an architectural piece of art. I mean, it's a beautiful, maybe our biggest piece of art in this town.
Joe French was chief draftsman when I was there.
Was he really? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Was he a good guy?
Oh, yeah, he was a great guy.
Okay. Well, and that doesn't surprise me. I think Kahn attracted people, but now I can say that.
He's the one that hired me.
Oh, really? Okay.
And he's the one
Well, then he was a brilliant guy, too, right?
when I told I was leaving when I decided to go out on my own.
Well, I bet he took it well.
He did.
Offered you congratulations. Yeah. Well, he did end up going over to Russia, too, and running their program there. So French was he was a very...
He wouldn't talk about it.
Fluid, no.
The guys there that were over in Russia would talk about it.
Wanted to talk about it. I guess I'm not surprised. They kind of lived in their own little compound, and they kept to themselves. And
it was terrible. That's about as much as they would say.
They would say it was awful.
Just about as much as they would say.
Yeah. Well, and I guess it was. And frankly, the Russians stole the technology and just replicated it. So... he did the second Temple Belle Isle on Woodward Avenue. It's still there. In fact, it's undergoing. I just saw a new sign. I'd pass it every day. New sign on it today saying under restoration. So they're working on that, getting it back into shape. Maccabee's building, again, that American vertical, a very popular style and very easy to work with. It architecturally, that's a very pretty building. He did the Kresge building over on Cass Park, right near the Masonic Temple, which of course was a George Mason project, so that the two of them, again, are working very, very close to each other, getting into the Art Deco stuff that Kahn could do. This is probably his most Art Deco one, the Ford Rotunda, which it's too bad that it is gone, because this really was a spectacular piece. And when you compare it with all the other pieces that Kahn built, this just stands out as being completely different.
Also built the Ford headquarters on Schaefer Road across the street from this. Was that a...
I don't know. But I can ask. See, I walk away from these things and I got to go look stuff up when I get home. But I don't know. Next time you see me, I'll have that answer. The good part is with this, not only did he do the beautiful temples of industry and the wonderfully efficient factories, but he could also put his hand on some beautiful homes where people, this is the George Booth House at Cranbrook, still very, very active. In fact, my mother-in-law is in development with Cranbrook. She works in one of those garret windows up at the top, third floor there. Still there all the time. This is his home. When it was undergoing a restoration. It's on Mack Avenue. It's now being used by the Detroit Urban League. But my favorite part of this, I've seen the inside of it. It's beautifully done. But for a man of his prowess and a man of his skills, this is a rather diminutive home. This is a very humble place for a man like Albert Kahn to be living. And I think this kind of reflects who he was. This was the guy who really, really loved his family. He had 3 daughters and a son. The son went on to be head of neurosurgery at the University of Michigan for years. One of his daughters married a man that got into the Kahn firm and was a driving force there for a while. And he also did a lot of work out in Grosse Pointe. This is Henry B. Joy, the man from Packard. Remember the patrons I mentioned? This is the Philip McMillan House. He worked for the DNC line when he built the Mackinac Hotel, the Grand Hotel. Here's Philip McMillan's house in Grosse Pointe. He also built the Grosse Pointe Shores Village Hall. I'm sure McMillan's had something to do with getting that contract there. And then the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House out in Grosse Pointe Shores. I mean, all of these, and when people say he's derivative, I think he would probably agree that they sat down with Edsel and Eleanor Ford and they said, we really like the Cotswold Cottage look. And Albert Kahn said, then that's what you're going to get. And he could do that. And if he wanted the classical look that Philip McMillan had, he could do that. If he wanted the English style manor house that Booth wanted, he could do that. He had the ability to understand the client, obviously get to know them very well and enjoy that. So here's where I got to go back to my notes. Albert Kahn died in 1942. He never did get to see a bomber roll out of this plant. He was a family guy. He enjoyed, there's a book of letters that one of his grandsons put together where he corresponded with his kids. One of his sons, Edgar, was in World War II. There's some wonderful letters he's writing to his son. His third child, Ruth, wonderful relationship with her. You can just tell by reading the letters how warm he was. They had a cottage out on Walled Lake. Unfortunately, I think it burned about 15 or 20 years ago. It's no longer around. But he'd love going to Tiger games. He was a workaholic. He'd sleep on his drawing table. And in fact, I was just talking with somebody earlier, and she was saying that his wife was kind of a hell on wheels type gal. But I believe Albert was a bit of a workaholic, so his wife was running the household all the time. Kept the kids in line. They all grew up to be really good kids, and Albert loved them. Taken to the Tiger game, he loved classical music. Never got over that love of classical music. Next time you're in orchestra hall, think of Albert Kahn as sitting in the chair next to you, okay? He also liked film comedy. He liked Chaplin. He liked Laurel and Hardy, but he really liked Harold Lloyd. Those of us who like comedy like Harold Lloyd the best too. I mean, really like it, right? So did he do it alone? Of course he didn't do it alone. We mentioned this. He had lots of teachers. He had lots of mentors. But he also had some influences. He loved Stanford White, McKim, Mead, and White. Did lots of skyscrapers. Mason, Bacon. These were all people who he was able to bounce ideas off with. He also worked with other firms. He worked with Field, Hinchman, and Smith before it became Smith, Hinchman, and Grills. He worked with Howard Crane. Gropius, I mean, his influence, people who he influenced, Gropius had a picture of the Highland Park plant on his desk, okay? Thought this was the most efficient use of space and the best way, most aesthetic way of presenting it. Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus School, loved what Albert Kahn did. And that's all part of his legacy, that and the team concept, bringing the engineer, the architect, the builder all together in the same room. And sheer numbers. By 1938, Kahn's staff had produced 19% of all the architecturally designed factories in the world. Okay, so his influence is everywhere, not just in Detroit or the nation, but around the world. He still exists. Albert Kahn Associates is still going very strong. This one they gave the ignominious name the Box, the old National Bank of Detroit building down on Woodward Avenue, but still being used, still very, very pretty building.
I worked on that.
That was that was a neat building, especially for its time. Congregation Sherry Zedek, probably one of the most outstanding and recognizable buildings in Detroit. The Penguin Penguinarium is what I want to call it, but they call it a conservation center, that just opened. So they're still very active. They're also very, very strong in hospital work. They did, that early children's hospital, but the children's hospital beyond that is part of theirs. And there's a children's hospital in Ann Arbor that I think has their name on it. And there's also the Taubman complex at Lawrence Technological University. So Albert Kahn Associates is still going very strong, carrying on his legacy. So out of all of this, if we got all of these names, all these wonderful architects, and they really were, they did some beautiful work, why does Albert Kahn bubble up to the top? He obviously could do residential, well-conceived adaptations of established forms, arguably, generally in the Grand English cottage style, but he also did Tudor and Georgian. He was very handy in that. Commercial buildings, those spectacular temples of industry, beautifully conceived structures, elegant pans to the classical architecture, and flawless compilations of cutting-edge theory, artistic and engineering-wise. He liked both sides of that. A real proponent of American Vertical and the Art Deco. I think, though, it's the industrial buildings. They were original, they were innovative, they were collaborative, and I think this is Albert Kahn. Without his industrial contributions, he's simply a regional genius like Wirt Rowland, who most people don't know. So I think it's the industrial stuff that really raised Albert Kahn up beyond that. Paul Krett, an architect and a biographer for Kahn, wrote, he had the humility of a craftsman who puts forth his work as naturally as an apple tree makes apples. I think that's a wonderfully simple statement about where Albert Kahn was coming from. His buildings were incredibly efficient. He liked a big footprint. He was really happy when Keller moved the tank plant out to Warren, when Ford brought him out here, which was just farmland. He could work with as big a footprint as he wanted, and he did. He absorbed large tracts of land. He had some technological things that he put in there that were both artistic and wonderfully efficient. And it's that Kahn Square thing. I had a studio in this building for many years. It's right down on the Detroit River, but where the cement plants used to be. And the only reason I got a studio there for $100 a month is because they couldn't tear it down. Okay? He built these things to last. We build them for 20, 40 years now. He built his buildings to last 100, 200 years. And when you're driving into Detroit, and you're kind of getting to that intersection where the Lodge and the Chrysler and the Ford all come together, and you look around and you see some of the old Fisher buildings, or you see the Russell Industrial Center, which was the old Murphy body, you're going to see those buildings, and you're going to see Albert Kahn in them, and you're going to say, God, why don't they tear those buildings down? Because Albert Kahn built them so damn well, they're really hard to tear down. If you're interested in looking further into this, there's some wonderful books. Hawkins Ferry did this. His Legacy of Albert Kahn is a book that went along with an exhibit that the DIA did. Wonderful, relatively short, very readable history. The American Institute of Architects Guide to Detroit Architecture isn't all Albert Kahn, but I swear if you turn 3 pages and you don't see the name Albert Kahn, you're not turning the pages fast enough. Architecture of Ford, of course, Bucci does a nice job of digging into that very small bit there. And then Hildebrand does a nice one of kind of expanding that beyond just Ford, but into all the other industrial architecture that he does. So I really appreciate you having me out here to do this at such a historic site, a site that has Albert Kahn's fingerprints all over it. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Can I ask a question?
You sure can. Thanks.
There was a house built purportedly for Henry Ford's girlfriend. I don't know if that's who it was. Also, there were stories that Lindbergh stayed there, but I'm told that he didn't.
And this is on which lake?
Right over here, almost across the street.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd like to think that was one of the smaller houses that Albert Kahn did for Henry Ford. but I don't know.
I would imagine. Well, he didn't build Fairlane. He didn't build his own home.
He didn't design it either, but it
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to think that his firm did that.
Okay. Well, I can't address whether Ford had a girlfriend who got a house out here. So, but that's good to add to the rumor mill. I can take that on to my next presentation. So, yes, ma'am.
Is there ever the opportunity to go inside the lighthouse?
There has been, yeah. The Coast Guard did that for about 5 years under one of their commanders. When that commander left, they have not allowed people in there since. We do a lot of tours. We'll take you into the Frito-Lay factory. We'll take you behind the scenes at Tiger Stadium. One of the behind the scenes that was really popular was getting into that lighthouse, and they won't let us do it anymore. So, and I go to breakfast with the commander. So they just won't let us in. That's right. That's right.
Is the lighthouse still functional?
It is, yeah. It's automatic now. They don't have to chase it. In fact, there's a lawsuit going on over the original lighthouse lens, which wasn't in that lighthouse. It was in the lighthouse before that, where the Coast Guard station is now. So keep an eye on the newspaper. There's always some good gossip going on about lighthouse lenses around. So, yes, sir.
Did Albert Kahn oversaw the construction of this building? The plant, the bomber plant?
Did he oversee the construction?
5 contractors that Ford picked. He had done work for Ford before. He picked the 5 contractors, and Albert Kahn was placed in charge to oversee the whole thing.
I believe that. I haven't read that, but sure. I would say that's probably, in order to get it built that fast, in fact.
Yeah, in my research, that was contractors that Ford had done business with. The plant was so big that there was no contractor in the U.S. that could handle building the factory on a timetable that they had. And Kahn came up with the idea, I'm going to build just a big open house, and after I build the place, you can decide what you're going to put inside of it. Because they didn't have time to say, we want the presses here or whatever, and they had to schedule it that when they built Section 1, as soon as the steel was up, the steel workers could go to Section 2 and the concrete people could come in, and there was a flow through the factory. And the factory would have been built in about 7 months, but the Army said, oh, we forgot, we got to paint them. You got to put a paint booth in, and that's where the famous 90-degree turn came up, and that held the factory back about 3 months on completion.
I also, when I was doing some research, found that he built toward the end of the war, because metal was so hard to get, he went very strongly into concrete construction. In fact, there was some gent who was talking to me about that, and he would have it set up so that they'd build the walls up, and then they would pour the roofs. And they had kind of a thing on a railroad car track that you'd pour the roof, and when it's set over a day or two, then they'd move that whole thing down, and they'd pour the next section, and they'd move the whole.
The Chrysler built the factory in Chicago to build the B-29 engines, and it was built by that method.
Okay, maybe that's the pictures that I saw.
Some of the guys that worked on, where is it now, over there,
Yeah.
on the Willow Run, told me they were working in there drawing while they were building around them.
I've heard that too.
They're just working.
24 hours. They were working around the clock, sure. Yep.
And of course, some of them, all they could do was gripe, but they never got paid overtime. But I don't know.
So.
A lot of them were very bitter against the Albert Kahn company. It's still working there.
Oh, really?
But they were very bitter.
That's an interesting. I hadn't heard that. Yes, sir.
What's your personal favorite Albert Kahn building, and what tour, behind the scenes tour, whatever kind of architectural tour, would you highly recommend that everybody should take?
I would have to agree with Kahn on his personal favorites. The Clements Library, especially for somebody in my business who goes and does research, is just a spectacular place to go and sit. You kind of forget to do your reading while you're sitting there looking around. It's just a gorgeous one. And then the Fisher Building, I love the Guardian Building too, but if I had to pick a Kahn building, the Fisher Building is a spectacular facility. And then as far as our tours go, if you really want to go, the tour of the Masonic Temple Masonic Temple is one of the most incredible buildings in Detroit. I think at its peak it had 43 different orders that were operating out of there. It had one massive theater, two smaller theaters, two ballrooms, one cathedral, and two other chapels. I think there's 1,010 rooms in the place. And some of them are as big as the auditorium. I mean, it's just an incredible building. If you go on the tour, it takes about 4 hours. And our behind-the-scenes tours, I'll tell you, sell out immediately to our membership. You have to be a member to get the first day in on our tours. And most of our tours will sell 75% of our tours the very first day to our membership. So I highly encourage it. If you'd like to get involved in that, we do behind-the-scenes tours. We do church tours, our historic houses of worship, which includes usually 4 or 5 churches a day and lunch, a motor coach type tour. Spectacular buildings. Detroit got blessed with some incredibly beautiful churches of all denominations, and those tours are great. Our behind-the-scenes tours, some of them are fun, getting behind the scenes at Tiger Stadium or getting behind the scenes at the Fisher Building. I mean, they're all wonderful things to see. So I always like to push those. If you're interested in architecture, that's a great way to go.
What's the name of the organization whose website I should subscribe to see when these tours occur?
Detroit Historical Society is my boss.
Can you please repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Especially this one. What organization do you go to if you want to get these great tours and see some wonderful exhibits? I work for the Detroit Historical Society. We run the Detroit Historical Museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and we also have a collection of about 300,000 things that are stored at Historic Fort Wayne. Our website, again, that very first slide, detroithistorical.org, will get you everything you need, including a phone number. If you don't like doing the web, call up and talk to some of our membership people or some of our events people. They'll send you out a brochure and take care of that. So there was somebody in the back there. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a quick question. One is, was Albert Kahn the first to use reinforced concrete in Michigan or the United States? Do you have any sort of that?
Everything I've read was that he and his brother were the first to use reinforced concrete in the United States. But I have not researched that. I've read all of those books that were there. They all claim that. I'm going to depend on that. It was coming in, and when you see the Kahn Square, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily a Kahn building. People picked up on reinforced concrete really quickly, and I know several buildings made with that style of architecture he had nothing to do with. So I'm sure that it was like the automobile. There were several people playing with it. Kahn became the most successful, the first. So.
Second question, do you offer tours of some of the, I think they're like Russian, what are their structures called? Not temples, but I guess like the Russian.
The synagogues? Yes. Do we offer tours of synagogues? We do. Usually on any one of our church tours, it will be 3 or 4 different denominations. They'll go to a Catholic church, they'll go to a Serbian Orthodox church, they'll go to a temple, and there's a really small little Buddhist thing over in Harper Woods they've stopped at. So we try to mix it up there.
At one of those Russian facilities, that the monks will actually lunch.
They do. That's the Harper Woods place. Yep. It's on a residential street. You could miss it. You drive right by it. But they bought like 3 or 4 lots, and they've got a really nice little chapel, and then they've got this tea room that they do. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just a plug for the Masonic Temple. My first auto show that I went to was down in the Fountain Ballroom and the Crystal Ballroom in the basement of that facility. And if you call the MTA, they do have tours, and they used to do it on Saturday morning where they take you through the lodge rooms and the theaters and the pool where they never put water in it.
Never put water in the pool. Nope.
Another architect came out and said that they put the water was way too much and it collapsed it. But they had it all Slavic tile and everything. It was quite a facility.
Yeah, it's an incredible building. It really is. Not to take away from all the other incredible buildings we've got in Detroit, but that one's pretty spectacular. So.
It's the largest Masonic temple
in the world. Yep, absolutely. And George Mason, I always like to throw that in. It's as close to Albert Kahn as you can get.
Now, did he build the Packard and the Dodge Main plants also? Because those were poured concrete structures.
I believe so. I know he made all the buildings at the Packard facility there on Outer Drive. And just judging by the architecture and the fact that he worked with the Dodge brothers, I would say he built Dodge Main, but I can't guarantee that. So.
But because I worked in both buildings.
Oh.
And the style of the concrete pillars to hold the next story up.
Oh, sure. Sure. Well, and that building on the riverfront that I had a studio in was exactly the same. They figured out the style, and that's what they did. So, yes, sir.
Did he ever, did he stroke the lines, or did he always have somebody else that was doing the drawing?
The question was, did Albert Kahn do all the drawings, or was there a lot of people? I've seen pictures of a room twice this big, covered with drawing tables that are as wide as you guys are, with guys on the table. They're actually drawing on the table on those big sheets of vellum. So I'm sure he had something to do with it, but he couldn't have turned out that many buildings all by himself. Yeah, no, there were. In fact, you could probably answer that.
He had a room full of designers.
Yeah.
Just designers.
Yep. And then the people who were doing the reproductions and the people who were getting it out to the job sites. And
over their shoulder once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
Just to see what they were doing.
Sure. Oh, yeah. No, he was kind of a hands-on guy, and I got the impression everybody liked him. People liked talking with him. He was.
Those that I talked to did, but there were some who just said that they got cheated.
Yeah.
Those that sued got their money. Those that didn't sue didn't get their money.
Huh. Okay. Well, I learned something. So, yeah.
My question is about Henry Ford's electric train that runs from, say, Detroit to somewhere in Ohio that was never finished. And I live in Taylor, and all my life I've been fascinated by these concrete arches.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say I don't know anything about Henry Ford's electric train, but you're right. I do remember those arches. He owned the Detroit and Ironton Railroad that ran down into Ohio, and so maybe that was an offshoot of that. He played with electricity a few times. He and Thomas Edison tried to make an electric car cheap, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get the battery right.
Those are all built of concrete. So
yeah. Well, if they were built during the war, that's all they had. So, yeah. Well, that's it. I really appreciate you having me again. I appreciate y'all showing up, too. Thank you.
So much for coming. This was fantastic.
Pleasure.